The first thing people tend to notice is the silence. Not the focused kind, but the kind that stretches too long, like something is missing. The overhead fluorescent lights flicker faintly, casting a pale glow over cracked, old tile floors. In classroom B7 of the Northside Employment Development Center, the air is still, but beneath that stillness is the presence of people unsure whether they even have the right to sit there. There are 12 of them in total, seated on mismatched plastic chairs arranged in a warped semicircle. Some wear name tags, others don't bother. The room smells of old printer ink, reheated coffee, and something like hope left too long in a drawer. At the very back corner of the room, where an old heater wheezes every few minutes, sat a man no one paid attention to. His hair was graying, his hands lined with time. A dark blue windbreaker zipped all the way up to his neck, even though the room wasn't cold. On his chest was a name tag scrawled with a smudged marker, simply reading, Ray. He didn't speak, didn't raise his hand, didn't check his phone like the others. He just observed, his gaze calm, focused, drinking in every word like it was the last precious thing he had. At the front of the class, a young woman with her hair tied back held a clipboard and spoke in a steady tone. Her voice was polite but dry, as if she had read this script hundreds of times and now wasn't sure it meant anything at all. Welcome to Week 1 of the Skills Acceleration Program. This is a 12-week course designed to help you earn a basic certification in logistics, data entry, and remote administrative support. Attendance is mandatory, participation is non-negotiable, and no one is guaranteed a certificate. That last sentence dropped like a rock. A guy in a beanie sitting in the front row muttered, "Then what the hell are we here for?" The instructor didn't answer. She turned to the whiteboard and began writing with a blue marker. No one in the room looked excited. Some looked exhausted. Others looked like they had already given up. Ray alone wasn't looking at her. He was staring intently, but not at the teacher. He was looking at a crookedly taped poster on the wall, at the wrong numbers on the bulletin board, at the flickering light, as if each detail was trying to tell him something. When it came time for introductions, the air in the room grew even heavier. "Let's just go around," the teacher said without lifting her eyes from the clipboard. "Your name, what you used to do, and what you hope to get from this program," starting from the left, one by one. "Alex, used to work in a warehouse. Been out of a job 2 months. Looking for something steady. Jenny, fast food. Now, just trying to try again. Luis, driver. Got a DUI last year. Here because probation made me." When it got to Ray, the room fell dead silent. The teacher didn't call on him. She just let the silence stretch until it got uncomfortable. Ray lifted his head slowly. "Raymond," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Used to work in systems." That was all. No one asked for more. Someone near the front muttered, "Sounds made up." Another snorted, "Bet this old guy coded on a typewriter." Ray didn't react. The teacher kept going like she hadn't heard. But if you look closely, you'd notice Ray's hand lightly tighten on his leg, then release. He didn't look at her again. His eyes were on the duct-taped air conditioner in the corner. The display was blinking. 84 degrees Fahrenheit. That evening, after everyone had left, Ray stayed behind. He carefully wiped down his seat with a folded napkin he took from his pocket. Then he walked to the bulletin board by the door. His eyes scanned the faded flyers, stopping at one. Hiring, part-time custodial. Posted 6 days ago. No benefits. Ray pulled out a pen from his pocket and scribbled in small letters at the corner of the page. Position filled. The next night he arrived early, earlier than the teachers, the staff, even the janitor. He brought a small toolbox. No one asked why. Outside classroom B7, the drinking fountain had been leaking for 3 weeks. Every night there'd be a puddle at its base. Ray laid down a cloth, crouched, opened the panel, and adjusted the valve. The dripping sound faded. A young woman in scrubs hurried past, then stopped. "Do you work here?" Ray just smiled. "Just learning how things break." By week 2, people began to notice something had changed. The whiteboard was no longer stained with old ink. The lights had stopped flickering. The heater didn't wheeze during class anymore. No one said anything. Some figured it was janitorial. Others didn't care. But Luis, the beanie guy, started calling Ray maintenance man. "Yo, maintenance man, You trying to get certified in floor mopping? Ray smirked. As long as there's a written exam. People laughed. Even the teacher let out a chuckle. For the first time since the course began, something had shifted, quietly beneath the surface. Ray wasn't just there to blend into the crowd anymore. He was there to observe, not just the students. Instructors rotated. Some were dedicated, some were checked out. One stood out, Wyatt, tight khakis, leather briefcase, severely lacking patience. He called Jenny slow when she struggled with Excel, smirked when Louise tried to participate, ignored Elise, the substitute instructor who always stayed late to tutor students. Once he looked at Ray and muttered, "What are you even doing here, old man? Let someone younger have that seat." That night Ray stayed late. He sat alone in the back row, eyes fixed on a corner of the wall where the paint was peeling. In his hands was a notebook. The cover was worn, faded, with 3 handwritten letters, NWDC, Northside Workforce Development Center. He turned the pages. Inside were system diagrams, maintenance schedules, staff training manuals, enrollment forms. Each line, in slanted, even handwriting, matched his own. When he closed the notebook, his hand lingered over a faint inscription inside the cover. People need respect before they need education. From the reception desk, a voice spoke softly. "Elise, I heard what Wyatt said to you," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Ray looked up. "You don't need to apologize." Elise hesitated. "I've been teaching here 6 years. They keep cutting back, cutting programs, cutting hours. I don't even know who runs this place anymore." Ray just looked at her, said nothing. She continued. "There used to be posters all over the walls, about second chances, about learning with dignity. They've all been taken down." Ray nodded slowly. "I remember." The next morning, Elise didn't show up to class. Rumors spread that she'd been summoned for compliance review. Wyatt returned, smug look, swagger in his step. Ray, still sitting in the same spot, same posture, same silence. But his hand was no longer still. His finger tapped lightly on the desk, once every 3 seconds, like a countdown, like something building. No one in class noticed. Not yet. But the clock had started. And when it struck, no one in that room would forget what was about to happen. Outside classroom B7, a rubber mat lay with its edge torn, jutting out just enough to trip someone not paying attention. One Tuesday evening during the break, Jenny stumbled on it and nearly fell. Louise chuckled, but without malice. She got up, smiled faintly, but her eyes lingered on the mat with a look that mixed surprise and sadness. "Back in high school, we had mats like that," she murmured. "But back then, they were new, and I was old." No one responded. They didn't have to. Everyone in that class knew the feeling, that feeling of being more worn out than the things that should have been replaced long ago. That day's lesson was on a new topic: supply chain management, warehouse basics. Wyatt was teaching. No one dared ask questions. He didn't like being interrupted. The slides were projected with a machine so old the image had purple borders. When someone asked about real-life application, he replied, "Just memorize it. You don't need to understand everything." When Louise tried to argue that you only remember things if you practice, Wyatt ignored him, then gave him a low score on the simulation test. Ray, as usual, stayed silent. But something in his gaze had shifted. It was no longer just observation. It was auditing. He was evaluating the entire structure, both visible and invisible, of a system once designed to uplift people, now reduced to a sieve that filtered out dignity. During the break, Ray walked around the back of the building. There was a small concrete courtyard with a few rotting wooden benches. Elise stood there alone, holding a lukewarm coffee. "You should be in class," she said, not turning around. "He's watching you." Ray stood beside her. "I'm watching him too." Elise laughed, but it was a weary laugh, without joy. This center used to have a different name. The programs were different too. I used to teach morning classes with students who were deaf, single parents, veterans. People came here because they wanted a fresh start. Now, she didn't finish the sentence. Her coffee cup trembled slightly. Ray said nothing, but his eyes turned to the rusted metal sign on the wall. Northside Workforce Center, we build futures. The word futures had lost its R. You know, Elise continued, last year they cut 40% of the GED budget and used the money to hire a team to film promotional videos about vocational success. They erased the founders' names from the website. This center, it used to have a soul. Ray nodded gently. I know. Lewis happened to walk by and saw the two of them talking. He looked curious but didn't stop. Back in class, he leaned over to Jenny and whispered, Ray's different, like not just some regular student. The following week, things changed in the classroom. A group of strangers in white shirts with name badges began walking around, taking notes, recording video, snapping photos. They said they were from the internal improvement team, but in truth, they were the media unit of the corporation that had acquired the center's operating system 4 years prior. They were producing a PR documentary for investors. They selected Wyatt's class as the main filming location. They gave prior instructions: only film people with good appearances. If anyone is too old or too quiet, have them sit in the back or step out. Ray was asked to move to the hallway. Elise was told to stay out of frame since she's not official staff. That day's shoot played out like a bad comedy. They told students to pretend to be enthusiastic and handed out scripted lines like, I'm so grateful for this center, and thanks to this program, I'm about to land a new job. Jenny was chosen for a shot because of her bright smile. But when the camera turned off, she quietly returned to her seat, her eyes blank. Ray, standing in the hallway, watched the scene without blinking. He took notes in his small notebook, not about the lesson, but about the people. Who got cut, who got used, who kept trying even when they knew they wouldn't be seen. Elise came up to him after the shoot. They don't need us, she whispered. People like you, like me. We're the parts that don't show up in the brochure. Ray picked up his pen and added a line. The people erased from the pictures are still the ones holding the soul of this place. The next day, Elise no longer taught the class. Instead, a young teacher named Tanya, with blonde hair and a fresh college degree, took over. Tanya was flustered, unsure of what to teach, and simply projected slides before falling silent. Students began skipping class. Louise fell asleep during sessions. Jenny showed up late, carrying a bottle of tranquilizers. An older student named Marcia, who once said she wanted to be a part-time bookkeeper, didn't return. She'd been dismissed after a test that Tanya hadn't had time to explain. Ray asked, did anyone call to ask why she stopped coming? No one knew. No one asked. The system didn't require it. The entire class slipped into a limbo, not fully hopeless, but not hopeful either. They studied to log hours, completed assignments half-heartedly, signed the attendance sheet like it was a survival ritual. Ray wrote in his notebook, when a place that was born to give opportunity ends up issuing certificates just to avoid liability, it means the system has forgotten itself. That night, he returned to the classroom after everyone had gone. On the teacher's desk was a stack of printed tests, blank names, blank dates. He picked one up, read it closely. Errors in questions 4, 6, and 9. Question 4 didn't even have a correct answer. He took a red pen, circled the flaws, and wrote a small note in the corner. Needs revision, otherwise everyone fails without knowing why. He placed the sheet back exactly as it was. No one would know he'd touched it. On the classroom wall was a frame board with a stated goal. Ensure 85% of students receive certification. But no one knew how that number was calculated. Elise once said, some people count as passing just by signing in enough times. It's a certificate for the system, not for the student. Ray looked at the board. His expression wasn't angry. It was heavy, like someone carrying a cracked building inside him, while the people inside kept stacking on more floors. In the middle row, Louise suddenly said, Mr. Ray, you know all those center schematics, don't you? I saw you sketching an electrical map earlier. Ray just smiled. I once saw a better version. Louise raised an eyebrow. Where? Ray replied softly. In memory. No one fully understood that sentence, but from that moment, something began to spread, slowly but surely. There was something about the old man in the back row that didn't match anything they had assumed. And the system, the very one that had begun to forget each small person within it, was now being watched. from the very last seat it had never cared to notice. The hallway behind classroom B7 was always colder than the rest of the building, even though that spring wasn't particularly chilly, perhaps because few people walked that way, or because the air ducts had long since broken and no one had reported it. No one paid attention to it, just as no one paid attention to the room at the end of the hall, with its silver-painted door chipped at the edges, the word custodial room barely legible, and the rusted doorknob. Inside was a world without a name, just the dim flicker of a fluorescent bulb, the scent of floor cleaner, a few brooms leaning against the wall, and an old wooden chair whose origin no one knew. Ray began spending time there starting in the third week. No one assigned him, no one asked. He simply walked in during lunch break when the hallway was free of footsteps. One time he brought a sandwich and a thermos, another time a board cleaning cloth. He placed his notebook on the plastic shelf, sat on the wooden chair, and wrote. Few people knew what he did in there. Some students assumed he was a temporary maintenance worker. Others guessed he lived nearby and came to class for warmth at night. But gradually, it was the very people most invisible to the system who began seeking out that unlocked door. Luis was the first. He'd returned to grab his jacket and saw Ray wiping the board. He stood outside the door, didn't come in, just asked, "Why do you keep doing all this stuff?" Ray didn't answer right away. He finished writing the last line in his notebook, then looked up. "Because I want to see what happens if I do the forgotten work. Will anyone notice?" Luis raised an eyebrow. "So this is like an experiment?" Ray nodded slightly. "An experiment that needs no equipment, just time and quiet." Elise, after being suspended from teaching, still came back to the building, not to teach, but to do temporary administrative work in the file room downstairs. One day she passed by the hallway and saw the janitor's closet door slightly ajar, a strip of light spilling into the hall. She paused. "I used to sit in there. 6 years ago, when I first started teaching, they said it was the place every new teacher should get familiar with first." Ray replied, "Everyone has to start somewhere. It's just that some get to move forward, while others get left behind." Elise sighed. "Sometimes I don't even know which of the two I am." In that small room, Ray taped a blank sheet of paper on the wall. Not a slogan, not a diagram, just a single handwritten line in blue ink. "Don't sweep away the past, just because the present isn't bright enough." Anyone who read it would go still for a moment, then leave without a word. One rainy night after class, while Ray was wiping down the desk in B7, a boy around 18 walked in. His name was Daryl. He had just joined the program in the first week, was Asian, soft-spoken, and rarely participated in class. Daryl nervously said, "I just wanted to ask, can I stay to study a bit longer? My house is crowded, loud." Ray looked at him for a moment, then gestured for him to sit. Without another word, he handed Daryl an abandoned worksheet. They sat side by side, lit only by the board lamp. That was the first time Ray explained data entry procedures in the simplest way he could. No jargon, no judgment. Daryl listened closely, his eyes brightening with each line Ray wrote. At the end, he said, "If classes were taught like this, I'd probably learn a lot more." Ray smiled faintly. "Because the class isn't the problem. The person running it is." The next day, Luis brought two more people, Jenny and a woman named Shanice, into the janitor's room to study. They brought snacks, notepads, even headphones to look things up on Google. Elise, though no longer a teacher, began passing Ray old materials she had saved. Lesson plans, practice exercises, and a faded diagram from the center's original training curriculum, designed by the founders. Each day, the janitor's closet saw more visitors. No one officially called it a class. No one called Ray teacher, but everyone came. Everyone learned, and everyone stayed longer than they planned. No one said it aloud, but they all understood. This was the heart the system had overlooked. One evening, while helping Shanice with an Excel chart, Ray quietly asked, "Why do you think they cut the most important classes from the program?" Shanice replied, "I think they realize the people who need it most are the ones with no voice." Ray nodded. "And if they don't have a voice, then who will speak for them?" From that day, Ray began recording the students' responses from the janitor's room. Not worksheets, but the answers they never had a chance to say aloud in the official class. He handwrote each one, numbered them, and filed them in a folder. The file grew thicker every night. By week 4, management discovered that the janitor's room was being used for the wrong purpose. Wyatt was the first to speak up during an internal meeting, saying, "Some students are gathering unsupervised. Could be a safety risk." The next day, the door lock was changed. A new sign was posted, "Authorized personnel only." Students returned, only to find the door wouldn't open. Daryl sat on the floor, clutching his backpack, eyes brimming with tears. Jenny murmured, "Why, though? We were just trying to learn a little more." Luis punched the wall lightly. No one stopped him. Ray stood in the hallway. He didn't look surprised. He simply bent down and picked up a piece of paper that had fallen near the door. It was a worksheet Elise had given. He folded it and placed it in his pocket, then turned and walked away, without a word. The next day, Ray didn't come to class, nor did he show up anywhere on the center's grounds. Students looked around, puzzled. Wyatt sneered. Guess he finally realized he didn't belong here. Elise overheard him. Her hands clenched until her knuckles turned white, but she said nothing. She returned to the records room, opened an old drawer, and pulled out a faded color printout, the original structure of the Northside Development Center, founded 2011. Founder, R.L. Johnson. Elise stared at the name. Her eyes stopped. R.L. Johnson. 3 letters, 3 letters, just like the 3 written on the notebook cover Ray always held at night. She sprang to her feet and ran to classroom B7. In her mind now was not just a suspicion, but a string of connections snapping into place, one by one. The man in the janitor's closet may not have been someone lost along the way, but the very person who once built the road itself. And if that was true, everything was about to change. In the basement archive of Northside Center, the smell of old paper and wall dust hung in the air like a thin layer of fog no one could ever wipe away. Faded cardboard boxes, document binders labeled with peeling tape, files printed on outdated machines. All of it resembled a graveyard of memories the system no longer wished to remember. Elise had been working here for nearly 2 weeks since being removed from her class. No one accused her. No one defended her. Just a brief email. Temporary reassignment, pay retained, no confirmation required. She didn't sign it. She didn't protest either. She simply showed up on time, received the keys, unlocked the archive, and began sorting through teacher records, student files, old reports. At first, she thought she just needed to endure, wait for the storm to pass. But then she found something that changed everything. That Wednesday afternoon, while sorting files of teachers who had worked from 2011 to 2016, Elise came across a thin folder with a pale blue cover and no clear title, just a handwritten label. J. Founding Drafts, Internal. The handwriting was neat and slanted. She opened it. The pages inside weren't contracts. They were the original program designs, course diagrams, a student assessment system based not on grades but on personal progress, a proposal to integrate multi-generational classes, and tuition support plans for reintegrating citizens. At the end was a faded color print with the title, Northside Workforce Development Center, Vision Statement 2011. Below that was a signature, R.L. Johnson. No one in the current system used that name. Elise remembered clearly, because in the early years of her work here, the founder had always been referred to as a former teacher with a vision. But since 2018, all public documents had changed. His name erased. The website now only vaguely stated, the system has been restructured and management transferred. She paused, quickly scribbled in the corner of her notebook, RL equals Ray L question mark. Her heartbeat quickened. She flipped back to the first few pages of the small notebook she had seen Ray carry often. The handwriting, the phrasing, even the use of a period at the end of each line, all matched. She took the folder and hurried up to the 3rd floor, where an old photocopier sat at the end of the hallway. She copied everything, slipped the copies into a separate envelope, wrote on it, Note, do not destroy. Then she hid the envelope in her desk drawer, locked it, and clipped the key onto her personal key ring around her neck. As she walked back down to the 1st floor, her steps were slower, but in her mind, a new map was already being drawn. That evening, Elise returned to B7, not to teach but to search. Ray still hadn't returned. The students had begun to dwindle. Jenny had missed 2 classes. Luis said he had taken a temp job at the market and wasn't sure if he'd be back. Elise stood in the empty classroom, staring at the board. No one had written on it anymore. She opened the cabinet beneath the teacher's desk, empty except for a red pen and a folded scrap of paper. She unfolded it. It was Ray's handwriting. If they forget who built the doorway, they'll knock forever without being invited in. Elise sat at a student's desk in the middle row. She laid both hands on the cold surface. In that moment, everything she had felt, loneliness, displacement, powerlessness, suddenly turned into strength. Because perhaps the man who had once been pushed out of this center, whose name had been erased from every report, had returned, not to reclaim fame, but to see who was still awake enough to recognize what was being stolen. The next morning, Elise made her way to the administrative office. 4th floor, a place she had never stepped foot in during her 6 years of working there. The hallway was quiet, wood-paneled with real plants. The walls were lined with plaques and event photos. In the center hung a large photo of the current leadership team, featuring Wyatt standing next to a middle-aged woman named Marlene, the current director of the center. Elise knocked on Marlene's door. Marlene gestured for her to come in. "We don't have a meeting scheduled today," Marlene said immediately, eyes still on her laptop screen. Elise sat across from her. "I'm not here to ask for my class back." Marlene looked up. "Then what do you need?" Elise pulled out the photocopies of the original program design. She laid each page on the table, slowly, silently. When she reached the page bearing the signature R.L. Johnson, she paused. "Do you remember this person?" Marlene was silent for a few seconds. Then she slowly pushed the folder aside. "Old business, old documents, no longer relevant." Elise met her gaze. "I think he's here now." Marlene flinched slightly. "What did you say?" "I think he came back, not as a director, but as a student. I think he's Mr. Ray." Marlene let out a short laugh, but it was a defensive one. "That's ridiculous." "Not as ridiculous as abandoning students, abandoning teachers, and calling it internal reform." The air tightened. Marlene stood and walked to the door. "Ms. Elise, I think you should take a few more weeks off." Elise didn't respond. She stood too. But before leaving the room, she left a message on the envelope. "Truth doesn't need to convince. It only needs to be seen." That evening, Elise returned to the janitor's closet. The door was still locked, but underneath, a piece of paper had been slid out. She bent down and picked it up. Handwritten. Ray's handwriting. "Tomorrow they will review student files. They'll try to remove anyone who doesn't fit the image. Be ready. As for me, I won't be behind this door anymore." She held the note, standing alone in the hallway. The overhead light flickered once, like a blink from someone who was still awake in a system pretending to sleep. The next morning, Ray returned to B7. He sat in his usual seat, but this time every eye turned to him, not with indifference but with anticipation. He raised his head slowly, then nodded gently to Elise, the only person in the system who still remembered the name that had been erased from every official record. And somewhere inside the dusty files and lifeless reports, a truth had begun to awaken. That day, the rain came earlier than usual. The streaks of water trailing down the window pane in classroom B7 looked like faint scratch marks, traces of erased names, erased voices, erased rights to exist. There were only 6 people in class. Jenny sat with her head against the side of her desk, eyes swollen like she had just been crying. Luis was silent, not joking like he usually did. Shanice tapped her notebook rhythmically, but didn't write anything. The new teacher sat in the corner, laptop open, headphones in, showing no interest in whether the class had anyone present or not. Only Ray sat upright, pen in hand, eyes following the sound of rain, as though he were listening to the language of an old world trying to send a message. 3 nights before, after receiving Elise's warning about the upcoming student review, a more polished way of saying they were weeding out those who didn't fit the image of modern, successful dynamic that the center was trying to project. Ray had sat all night in the tiny kitchen of his weekly rented boarding room near the train station. He opened his old notebook, picked up a pen, and began to write. Not as someone who once founded the center, but as a student, a person now being pushed out of the very system he had helped build. He wrote calmly, without blame, without anger, only truth and sadness. The letter was 6 pages long. The first page was a personal reflection on what had been happening at the center. Teachers suspended without clear reason, students pushed out of class for failing to meet image standards, and training programs reduced to mere performance. The second page recounted the history of the center, not to boast, but to remind them that this place was once a home with doors open to all, with lights kept on for those whose chances had already gone dark. Pages 3 and 4 outline specific consequences. Jenny, who lost her job due to health issues but never received career counseling. Luis, who had a criminal record but had never been referred to any employers. Daryl, a young student shunned for not speaking fluent English. Page 5 proposed clear solutions: restoring personalized student support systems, reopening free tutoring sessions, and reinstating teachers who had been temporarily cut but in truth were quietly eliminated. The final page Ray wrote by hand, not typed. "I'm writing this letter not expecting a reply, but in hopes that your conscience might awaken. If it still exists somewhere in the system I once gave both my name and trust to." He signed it, Raymond L. Johnson. No title, no resume attached, just the name, as a soft reminder that he had never truly left this place. The next morning he printed 3 copies of the letter. One he placed in the internal feedback box, a rusted metal box next to the front desk that now only existed as decoration. One he sent anonymously via email to the system's administrative management, and one he handed directly to Elise. "If everything disappears, at least you'll still remember," he said softly. Elise took it. She didn't ask why, didn't say thank you. She just gently tightened her grip on the paper, as if reminding herself that not everything was meaningless. 2 days later, the response came, not in a letter, but in action. On Friday at noon, when Ray walked into classroom B7, he saw that his seat no longer had a name tag. Instead, there was a printed sign, "Reserved for center guest." By the whiteboard, Wyatt stood smiling. "Mr. Ray, please sit in the back. We have some sponsors visiting today, so we've rearranged things a bit." Ray said nothing. He stood still. A student named Malik, who had never spoken to Ray before, whispered, "Why are they making you move?" Wyatt turned around. "No one's being moved out. This is just classroom organization." Elise entered at that moment. She looked at the scene, walked over to Ray, grabbed a chair, and placed it back in its original spot. "If this seat once belonged to the man who laid the foundation for this center, then I believe he has more right to sit here than any sponsor ever will." Wyatt's face turned pale. Elise looked him straight in the eye. "I was the one who printed the original program design. I know who wrote it, and I know who tried to erase his name." That afternoon, Elise was summoned for an emergency meeting with the board. The agenda: creating a negative impression of the center. After the meeting, she was suspended indefinitely. The internal feedback box where Ray had placed his letter disappeared, replaced by a red bulletin board with the words, "All feedback must go through approved online channels." In the system's email, Ray's letter was labeled internal spam. No one read it. The physical copy he had submitted was destroyed. Elise found it folded in half, discarded in the recycling bin. That night, Jenny came to class but didn't step inside. She stood in the hallway, tears falling silently. "I saw it all," she told Ray. "They don't care whether we're learning anything. They just need a few names to write on reports." Ray nodded. "That's why I wrote the letter." Jenny wiped her tears. "And they tore it up." Luis arrived shortly after, soaked in his raincoat, but didn't enter the room. He stood beside Ray and spoke quietly. "It's the first time in my life I've seen an old man write a letter for us. Not a lawyer, not a relative, just someone like us." Ray placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the system doesn't need to be destroyed. It just needs to be asked the right question." Luis chuckled. "And if it refuses to answer?" Ray replied, "Then we rewrite the question in a way it can never erase again." The next day, a handwritten note appeared pinned to the main hallway bulletin board, the one usually reserved for class schedules and rule notices. No title, no sender. Just a short passage. They call it a development center, but it doesn't develop people, only images. They call it an educational system, but don't allow anyone to ask questions. So who really needs training here? The students or the ones running it? That morning, every student in B7 stood in front of the board, reading in silence. Elise wasn't there. Ray wasn't either. But everyone knew, though it bore no name, no logo, no certificate, that message could never be removed now. Because it had entered the eyes of those who had once been silenced. The first letter never reached its destination, but its meaning was no longer sealed in an envelope. And when a system begins to tremble over a piece of paper, then maybe, just maybe, the truth has started to find its way in. On Monday morning, the main hallway of the Northside Center was unusually spotless. The old bulletin boards had been quietly taken down, replaced with glossy new posters bearing large, sky blue slogans. Build your future today. The same slogan looped on digital screens, normally reserved for class schedules and temperature check reminders, now scrolling a ticker that read, Welcome Media Filming Day. Students, show your positivity. In classroom B7, Wyatt entered early, clipboard in hand, voice louder than usual. Good morning. Today we have special guests. The internal media team from headquarters will be filming a video for the Learn to Transform campaign. There will be interviews, classroom footage, and a few selected success stories. He scanned the room, then continued, his voice even. Some students will be prioritized for filming. The rest, please avoid moving through the shooting area. Let's minimize unaligned visuals. No one asked what unaligned visuals meant, but everyone understood. And this time, no one looked surprised. Daryl, the quiet young student who usually sat at the back, whispered to Ray, Who are they going to film? Ray answered, Not the ones learning how to be silent. The boy lowered his head. He understood. Jenny, sitting up front, smirked. I wore a button down, did my hair, still probably won't be picked. Don't look enough like a success after struggle case. Wyatt began reading the list of students selected for interviews. 2 white individuals, a middle-aged woman with dyed blonde hair, and a young man named Owen, new to the class, formerly an IT intern, well-spoken and neatly dressed. The rest were suggested to leave class early due to frame overload. Louise stood up abruptly. So we're not students anymore, huh? Wyatt smiled like he'd rehearsed the moment. You're still students, but today is a special day. The public-facing image needs to be curated. We hope for your understanding. Ray said nothing. He stepped out into the hallway. No frustration, no rush. Just the walk of someone who had seen this too many times before. Elise had warned them, PR teams don't come to capture the truth. They come to stage a more digestible version of it. The third floor, where the crew had set up, looked like a small film studio. Softbox lights, boom mics, blocking panels, multi-angle cameras. A woman wearing a name tag that read, Kristen Strategic Communications, was speaking into a wireless headset. Let's amp up the energy. Ask that question again, but smile more this time. Don't mention unemployment, please. In one corner, a whiteboard listed the interview script. The third question was, what made you feel empowered at the center? The suggested answer, written in red marker, read, Thanks to the professional support system and dedicated instructors, I feel like I can change my life. Ray looked at that board, then quietly walked away. He didn't need to read the rest. Downstairs in the hallway, Elise walked by, carrying a stack of new documents from the archive. Among them was a student evaluation chart labeled Media Suitability, scored using internal metrics, appearance, camera readiness, family background, and public inspiration potential. Elise stopped mid-stairwell. She couldn't believe what she was holding, a ranking sheet of students as if they were products, based not on academic progress or potential, but on performative criteria. That evening, the media team filmed the positive learning environment. Wyatt led the class loudly, pacing, sketching charts on the board. Selected students sat in the front row, smiling and nodding. The director repeatedly signaled, Say it again. Look into the camera. Raise your hand like you're excited. Everything was edited on the spot. Ray wasn't in the frame. Elise wasn't on the support list. Louise was asked to fetch water just as the cameras rolled. Jenny was told her shirt didn't match the color tone, and should stay out of shot. The edited video was completed in 3 days. A week later, all staff, students, and investors received an email with the subject line, "Discover the new journey at Northside, the inspirational video you can't miss." The video was 2 minutes long, uplifting music, shots of bright classrooms, energetic instructors, youthful students. Not a second showed the supply room, the janitor's closet, or the worn hallways of B7. No mention of Elise, the night learners, or the unofficial tutoring sessions. No one knew who Daryl was. Ray didn't exist. Luis finished watching and slammed his phone onto the desk. "That's it. We never existed to them." Ray stepped forward, placing a piece of paper in front of him. It was a dot matrix printout, the very first page of the original 2011 Northside blueprint. The first line read, "We didn't build a system to take pictures. We built it to empower." Luis looked up at him. "So what do we do now?" Ray replied, voice low. "Take the real picture, but this time make sure they're the ones who have to see it." That afternoon, a group of students, uncoordinated, unscripted, filmed a video on their phones. It included footage of the janitor's closet, the unofficial extra help sessions, Jenny's account of being excluded, Luis reading Ray's letter, and Daryl, appearing on camera for the first time, saying, "If learning changes lives, why didn't someone like me make it into the video?" Elise edited the video. She used no effects, no background music, just real light, real sound, real people. The video was uploaded anonymously under the account from the back row. In less than 48 hours, it surpassed 70,000 views on Northside's internal employee platform. In the comments section, someone wrote, "I used to work there. What they said is true." Another replied, "So not everyone stayed silent after all." 3 days later, the entire system received an email from the CEO of the parent company announcing an audit of media integrity practices and the suspension of all promotional video campaigns until an independent review is complete. No one knew who uploaded the original video. Elise said nothing. Ray said nothing. But in classroom B7, the back row was no longer empty, and the system, for the first time, had to face the camera, not to perform, but to confront the truth. In the 8th week, the class schedule for B7 was abruptly changed. An email was sent at 5:45 a.m. on Monday with no explanation, just a notice. All students will participate in the final competency assessment on Wednesday. Attendance is mandatory. No makeup test will be provided. The email had no sender's name, just a digital signature from Student Affairs Division. Elise read the email while sitting in a cafe near the center. She called Jenny. No one picked up. She messaged Ray. No scene tick. At that moment, Elise knew this wasn't just a regular exam. It was the next step in a carefully designed plan to eliminate those deemed unfit for the image by pushing them out through what appeared to be a fair process. On exam day, the entire building seemed to transform. Desks were neatly rearranged, and the bulletin board displayed bold letters, "Evaluation Day, your future begins here." A few new staff appeared, wearing light-colored suits, silver-plated name tags, and carrying tablets as they walked around inspecting. When Jenny entered the class, someone stopped her. "Your name isn't listed for this room. Please proceed to room 2D." Room 2D was a side room next to the storage area, windowless, usually used to store broken desks. Luis was also removed from the main group. Daryl, the young student who appeared in the "From the Back Row" video, couldn't find his name on any list. "Probably a system glitch," the staff member said, without making eye contact. Only the students featured in the previous media video were seated in the main room, with air conditioning, new computers, a clean whiteboard, and a tech assistant on standby. The rest were scattered into side rooms, receiving thinly printed tests, smudged ink, and questions with faint text. No one questioned it. Everyone just tried to finish as fast and as correctly as possible, hoping that if they behaved, they'd be allowed to stay. Ray was placed in room 2D. The chair was creaky wood. The overhead light flickered. There was no wall clock. The exam was printed on a torn A4 sheet, 30 multiple-choice questions, and 2 situational simulations. From the very first question, Ray saw the problem. The wording was vague, filled with technical terms never taught in class. Question 3 had a fill-in-the-blank paragraph, but one line was missing. Ray turned to the proctor. "Excuse me, I think this question is missing part of the text." The proctor, without looking up, replied, "Do the best you can. Each student gets only one copy." Ray continued. From question 5 to 10, he found 3 that had no correct answer. In his mind flashed back to nights weeks ago, when he had corrected this very test in silence, circling mistakes, adding notes. Content needs revision. And now those same errors remained, unfixed but used as the official grading tool. From a distance, Ray heard a proctor sternly whispering at someone. It was Daryl. The boy was trying to ask if he could still take the test. The proctor pushed him away from the hallway, saying his name wasn't in the system. "So we can't process you today." Daryl sat down on the floor, hugging his backpack, eyes red. Ray stood up. "I need to use the restroom," he said to the proctor. The man hesitated, then nodded. Ray didn't head toward the restroom. He walked straight to Daryl. "They said you're not on the list, but you're here. That's enough." The boy looked up, eyes ready to cry. "They're going to kick me out, I know it, like they did with the others last week. They call it self-withdrawal. But I didn't withdraw." Ray sat next to him. "Don't let them rewrite your story using their words." After the exam, Jenny came to find Ray. "You know what? There was a question on logistics software. Something we've never studied. How are we supposed to pass?" Ray nodded. "The test wasn't meant to decide who stays. It was designed to justify removing people." Lewis clenched his fist. "They programmed the test the same way they programmed the video. Outcomes already decided." The next day, the results were posted on the bulletin board. Those removed didn't get emails or announcements, just saw their names gone from the class list. Daryl disappeared. Jenny requested leave for personal reasons. Luis stood reading the list for a long time, then chuckled and shook his head. "We didn't pass the test, but they failed the trust." That afternoon, Elise met with Ray. She spoke quietly. "I heard the execs are preparing a performance review to submit to the oversight board. They might use the exam to cut over 40% of ineffective students." Ray asked, "Is anyone speaking up?" Elise shook her head. "Everyone's tired." Ray opened his bag and pulled out a marked-up exam paper. Every flaw was circled, each annotated with dates. He looked at Elise. "If they use the exam to remove people, we'll use it to respond, not with emotion, but with logic." That night, Ray stayed up writing. He typed a 16-page document, analyzing every error in the test, comparing it with class content, measuring it against the training program's stated promises, and exposing how the system had engineered a rigged playing field, a manufactured failure. The document was sent to Elise and to 3 former core instructors of Northside, people Ray had personally trained in the early days. The next day, an anonymous internal report appeared in the center-wide email system. "This exam doesn't test knowledge, it tests obedience." Attached was Ray's document. Leadership panicked. The internal bulletin was suspended. Staff were told not to share information. But the report had already been downloaded by over 120 people within the first 3 hours. Wyatt called an emergency meeting with the proctors, but he didn't know someone in that room recorded the entire conversation. In the recording, when someone asked, "If the test is flawed, should we reevaluate the results?" Wyatt responded, "It doesn't matter. Everyone who failed was someone we never intended to keep." 3 days later, the recording was sent to Elise, along with a note. "They failed the test, not us." And in classroom B7, though Ray's name had been replaced with another on the seat, someone still quietly placed a blank sheet of paper there every day. On it was a single line, "We haven't left. We're just waiting for them to look again." Late June in Denver carried a strange kind of quiet. It wasn't the clenched cold of winter, nor the stifling stillness of July, but something suspended, between morning and night, between rain and dryness, between deciding to stay or to leave. That night, Ray sat alone in a rented room on the second floor of a weekly rental complex, tucked behind a car wash that had long closed down, about 4 blocks from the Northside Center. The room measured no more than 8 square meters, just enough to fit a metal bed frame, a folding table, a reading lamp held up by double-sided tape, and a window facing a barren concrete lot. No one stayed there long. It was a place for people passing through, And Ray, in a way, was also a man passing through his own life. On the table was a gray canvas bag with worn-out straps, the only item he'd carried from his old apartment on the east side of the city, back when he still bore the title of founder. Inside were documents no one had asked him to keep: the original 2011 training program blueprint, the first memorandum between him and the city council, thank you letters from former students, and copies of everything the current center pretended had never existed. That file wasn't just evidence. It was a reminder that someone had once built this place with a heart, not just numbers. Ray sat in silence for a long time. The red alarm clock on the desk blinked. 11:52 p.m. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to. He was familiar with the dark. It no longer frightened him, but had become a quiet companion. In the dim glow of the street lamp shining through the window, he opened his notebook and flipped to a page near the middle. He had written it during the third week of returning to Northside, on another quiet night like this one. On that page was just a single passage. If one day they forget your name, let them remember your actions. If they erase your face, leave behind what can't be forgotten: how you listened, how you asked the right questions, and how you stayed when no one wanted you there. Ray stared at the words for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and set it beside a neatly clipped bundle of documents labeled in bold capital letters: evaluation data, ethical breaches, confidential. These weren't things he intended to keep as mementos. They were what he would carry with him the next morning, to the last place where someone might still have the authority to listen. The last time Ray walked into the regional coordination office of the Northside system was 11 years ago. Back then, he was still called founder, still received invitations to annual conferences, still had his name in the opening remarks of the executive director. But then, little by little, with each strategic shift, each reform plan, each unanswered call, he realized he was no longer invited. Not by dismissal, but by deliberate silence. They didn't need to erase his name. They just stopped mentioning it. And that was enough to erase a person from an organization he had built. But the saddest part wasn't being forgotten. It was watching new people: Elise, Jenny, Luis, Daryl, being pulled into a system that had lost its heart. A machine he had once designed to uplift now operated to sort. They were judged not by potential, but by performance. Not by effort, but by media-friendly image. Ray had tried to quietly repair it, offering after-hours lessons, documenting ethical violations, writing letters of concern. But the letter was torn. The suggestion box was removed. Elise was suspended. Daryl was erased from the system without a word. And now the test. A test designed to ensure failure. A disguised recruitment filter. A trap labeled competency assessment. Ray stood up. He took his coat from the hook, slowly repacked the documents into his bag. Then he looked around the rented room, the tiny space he had lived in quietly for the past 2 months. Each night spent there had reminded him, sometimes to fix something that's broken, you must let yourself be seen as the broken part in the system's eyes. Disregarded, removed from the class, treated like a bothersome old man. But it was precisely because he stood outside their mold that he could see the whole picture. The one the administrators were hiding beneath polished PR campaigns. He left the room at 2:17 a.m. The streets were silent. Red and blue neon signs reflected off the wet pavement. Ray walked down 18th Avenue past a gas station, a 24-hour donut shop, and a cobbler's store long closed. He passed the bus stop where Jenny once spent the night after being evicted from her hostel. He passed the graffiti wall Luis had pointed at, saying, "This was painted by someone who used to study here." He passed the convenience store where Daryl used to work part-time, until the manager let him go for not speaking clear English. All those places, all those people, were the reason he could not turn away again. When he arrived at the gate of the regional coordination office of the Northside system, the clock on his phone flipped to 3:41 a.m. The gate was still locked. No one was there. But Ray didn't need to go inside. He just needed to leave a mark. He pulled out the file, attached a brief 3-page summary, stating clearly, "The current system is operating against the original philosophy of Northside. Programs have been distorted. Students have been discarded. Teachers have been silenced. If you don't reconsider now, the mission will collapse. Not because of failure, but because of betrayal. He signed R.L. Johnson, someone who once believed in this place. He placed the file in the secure drop box beside the gate, the kind designed for confidential internal reports. Then he stepped back 3 paces, stood upright, looked up at the 3-story building with its purple-black reflective glass. In his heart there was no resentment, only the quiet calm of someone who knew. He had done his part, the hardest part. As he turned away, a light on the second floor suddenly turned on. Someone was still awake. That morning at 6:58 a.m., Elise walked into classroom B7. On her desk lay a brown manila envelope, unmarked. She opened it. Inside was a full copy of the file Ray had delivered the night before, along with a handwritten note. If they test us tomorrow, then today, we test them. Elise stood still for a moment, then sat at the teacher's desk. She knew that from this moment on, the game had changed. And from the end of the hallway, near the bench where students usually ate lunch, a boy with black hair sat upright, hugging his backpack. It was Daryl. He had returned. No one called him, but he came back. Because the only person who ever taught him how to learn was someone who was no longer called a teacher, and that person had not left. Outside the window, morning had just begun to break. The sky was not clear, but it wasn't raining either. The night had passed, and something was coming. Not anger, but truth. Wednesday, 8:05 a.m. The Regional Coordination Building of the Northside System lit up from the 3rd floor. A nameplate on the glass door read, Regional Executive Leadership, Confidential Meeting. Inside was a large conference room, 3 walls frosted glass, a long rectangular wooden table with 12 black leather chairs arranged symmetrically. At the head of the table sat Marlene Ashcroft, the regional director, silver hair swept back, gold chain glasses, reading the agenda with an expression that never changed. To her left was Wyatt, face calm, but eyes visibly tense. To her right, 2 area supervisors, Daniels and Grant, wore light-colored suits and leaned back as if they were only there out of obligation. A large screen was already on, displaying Internal Review, Evaluation Breach Allegations. Below that, presenter, Raymond L. Johnson. A brief silence followed as the name appeared. Then Marlene tapped her pen lightly on the table. Let's begin. The door opened. Ray walked in. White dress shirt buttoned to the collar, no tie, gray canvas bag slung over one shoulder. No one stood to greet him. No one extended a hand. But he didn't wait. He walked to the end of the table, pulled a thick folder from his bag, placed it neatly in front of him, and looked each person in the eye. I'm Raymond L. Johnson. I was the one who built the original Northside training program. I used to be invited into this very room to talk with you about opportunity, justice, reintegration, and student-centered education. Today, I'm not here to reclaim an identity, but to ask, do you still remember what those words actually mean? No one answered. Wyatt crossed his arms. Daniels glanced at Marlene. Grant sat up straight. Ray opened the folder. The first page was a photo of the evaluation test from the previous week, with 3 glaring errors circled in red. This is the test you called an objective measure of competency. Question 3 has no correct answer. Question 7 is missing a line. Question 12 requires knowledge not covered in any curriculum taught within the last 3 months. He turned to the next page, a list of students who were dismissed. 28 students were removed after this test. 6 of them appeared in the media file labeled unfit for public image, 4 had submitted internal feedback, and every one of them had attended the informal study group in the janitor's closet. He paused. You didn't remove them for low scores. You removed them because they weren't the version of Northside you wanted the public to see. Wyatt opened his mouth. We don't confirm the existence of any media suitability list. All criteria are based on data. Ray looked at him. I knew you'd say that. That's why I brought the data. He flipped the next page. A compiled internal email log clearly outlining assessments of students based on appearance, accent, and personal background. One email sent by Wyatt read, Don't feature Daryl, heavy accent, looks weak. Ray stared directly at him. That boy was excluded from the exam entirely. No email, no explanation. Marlene raised her hand to signal quiet. Mr. Johnson, I acknowledge there may have been execution errors, but you also know that managing a large system requires standards. We can't individualize everything. Ray nodded slightly. I understand standards are necessary. What I oppose is when you use standards to erase people, when you call indifference professionalism, when you treat silence as proof of consent, and when you allow yourselves to evaluate others, but refuse to be evaluated in return. Daniels frowned. Are you accusing us of lacking transparency? Ray answered without hesitation. Number, I'm saying you're afraid of it. The room tightened like a drawn wire. The atmosphere no longer felt like an internal meeting, but a public inquiry. Yet no one walked out, because somewhere deep down, they knew what he said wasn't wrong. Ray stepped toward the whiteboard in the room. He drew a circle, then split it into 3 parts. When we built Northside, the philosophy rested on 3 pillars. First, students are not just learners, but citizens with a voice. Second, teachers are not just transmitters of content, but keepers of opportunity. Third, every policy must withstand one question: does this treat the most vulnerable fairly? He turned back, gaze calm but unyielding. Now look at your current program. Students are afraid to ask questions. Teachers like Elise are suspended. Whistleblowers are labeled disruptive. And the most vulnerable are cropped out of the frame. Marlene leaned back, silent. In that moment, no one in the room pushed back, because they couldn't. Ray continued, his voice lower now, but with the weight of a hammer striking the basement of an old building. I don't need your apology. I don't want my old title back. I want one thing. Stop. Stop the flawed evaluation program. Stop punishing Elise. Stop pushing students out just because they don't look good on camera. And if you can't do that, then say it clearly, that today's Northside has nothing to do with the one I built. Wyatt jumped in. We need time to review procedures. We can't act on emotion. Ray smiled faintly. I'm not speaking emotionally. I'm speaking with data, with real names, with proof from your own system. And if that's still not enough, perhaps I need a different forum. Grant looked at him. Are you planning to go public? Ray didn't answer right away. Instead, he held up a printed copy of the handwritten letter Elise had received the morning before. On it was written, if they test us tomorrow, then today we test them. He laid it down. I don't want to harm Northside, but if I must choose between silence and truth, I choose truth. Marlene looked around the room. She knew. If they stayed silent, they'd lose. If they denied it, they'd fall. And if they threatened him, it would only cause what Ray brought to spread faster. Finally, she said, we need time to reevaluate. Ray nodded. Time is what I gave you for 11 years. I'll give you 3 more days. After that, if nothing changes, I'll release the full file. Not to the media, but on your own internal platform. So your staff and students across the system will know exactly what they're part of. He gathered his folder. 3 days, Ms. Marlene. I believe a just system has the courage to be accountable. If not, then maybe it's time to rebuild from the ground up. He walked out of the boardroom, not bowing, not rushing. Behind him was complete silence, but not the indifferent kind from before. It was the kind of silence that comes when people know. The paint has started to crack, and beneath it, truth is waiting to be called by its rightful name. Thursday morning, the Denver sky was covered in a low sheet of lead-gray clouds, as if something was about to break open. Elise arrived at classroom B7 earlier than usual. She wasn't wearing her usual worn-out blouse, but a crisp white shirt, buttoned all the way up. Her face was tense, but her eyes were clear. On the teacher's desk was still the note Ray had left the day before. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible. If they test us tomorrow, then today we test them. 8:12 a.m. The door opened. Jenny entered, followed by Luis, Shanice, and 2 other students who had been assigned to the overflow rooms during the exam. No one spoke. They simply nodded to Elise and sat in the front row, something they had never done before. Elise looked at them, then toward the back row. Ray wasn't there. 8:24 a.m. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't students. Wyatt, wearing a suit, holding a clipboard, flanked by 2 internal security officers in black uniforms with no name tags. He marched straight to the front, tapping the edge of the desk like he owned the space. Apologies for the interruption. We have a matter to resolve before class can begin. He scanned the room, then locked eyes on Daryl, the boy sitting in the third row, head lowered, hugging his backpack. Mr. Daryl Nguyen, according to the Office of Student Affairs and Records, your name is no longer listed as an active student. You are not permitted to be in class today. The air thickened. Elise shot to her feet. Daryl returned as a student pending review. He has every right to be here. Wyatt didn't look at her. He nodded to the officers. Please escort him out. Daryl stood, hands shaking, but didn't cry. He kept repeating, I just want to learn. I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to learn. Jenny screamed, Don't touch him. Louis jumped up. Who gave you this right? Elise stepped in front of Daryl. If you take this child out of here, I will resign from this system immediately. But Wyatt didn't flinch. He gave the signal. One officer stepped forward. Daryl backed into the corner, still clutching his backpack, eyes wide, his voice caught in his throat. The classroom door flew open again. Ray. No one had called him. No one knew he was coming. But he was there. And he didn't come alone. Behind him were three individuals. A black woman in a gray suit, the director of ethics oversight, an older man with silver hair, Northside's first founding director, and finally the one who made the entire room freeze, a teenage boy of Latin descent in a Northside jacket, wearing an old student ID badge, Miguel Reyes, the son of one of Northside's original donors, whose scholarship had been revoked without explanation. Ray stepped forward, slowly, calmly, but his eyes were bright and unflinching, like headlights slicing through long hidden truths. Stop, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the room stopped breathing. Wyatt turned. You have no authority here. Ray took another step. If I have no authority, then why is my name still on the lease agreement for this center? Marlene appeared at the door, just in time to hear those words. Her face went pale. No one knew, but since Ray left the boardroom days ago, every document he submitted had made its way to Northside headquarters in Chicago. And from there, a directive had been issued. All personnel actions in the Denver region were to be frozen pending formal investigation. Ray walked to the front. He looked directly at Daryl, the boy still huddled in the corner, terrified. He reached out his hand. You may return to your seat. Daryl stepped forward slowly. Each footstep unraveled a tight knot of shame wound inside the room. When he sat down, head bowed, only then did the class finally breathe again. Ray turned to everyone. Where do we stand when a child is dragged out of class for the way he pronounces words that don't match the center's commercials? What do we do when the only teacher left with fire in her heart is suspended for standing up for what's right? And who are we if we let a PR supervisor decide the future of those trying to start over? Wyatt opened his mouth, but Marlene raised a hand to stop him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The presence of Ray's group said everything. Ray looked at each student. I didn't come here to be a hero. I came to listen. I sat in the back row. I wrote down the things they tried to hide. And day by day, I saw it clearly. This center isn't broken because of money. It's broken because no one listens, because it lacks integrity, because no one has the courage to face the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper, the flawed exam. This is what they use to remove you, but if there's a real test to be taken, it's the one for those they call the gatekeepers. He turned to Wyatt. The question is, who did you open the gate for? And who did you shut it against? No one answered, but everyone in the room understood. That gate was no longer locked from the inside. Marlene stepped forward, quietly, then nodded to Ray. We will reinstate the full oversight program, reverse Elise's suspension, restore the records of all dismissed students, and place Mr. Wyatt on immediate administrative leave. Louis called out, Not administrative. Make it permanent. The class burst into applause. Elise cried. Jenny hugged Daryl. Shanice collapsed into her seat, laughing through tears. Ray said nothing more. He turned, picked up his canvas bag, and walked toward the door. Daryl whispered, Mr. Ray. Ray turned back. Will you keep teaching us? Ray smiled. From now on, the class belongs to you. I'll just be in the background. But when the door jams, you'll know who has the key. The whole class stood, not by signal, not by command, but because something had shifted. And in that moment, the system was no longer a wall. It was a room where the final door had opened. The morning after Ray stood before classroom B7 and stopped the expulsion of Daryl, the internal systems at Northside Denver began to slow down abnormally. The electronic bulletin board stopped updating. Internal announcement channels were cut off. The internal media account Northside Vision suddenly went into maintenance mode. But that didn't stop the wave, because real voices no longer belonged to those who controlled the bulletin board. It all started with one simple video file, a 6-minute clip of Ray standing at the front of classroom B7, holding up the flawed exam, looking Wyatt in the eye and saying, "Who holds the gate and who are they closing it against?" The clip was filmed on Louis' phone, originally shared only within a private group of former students. But less than 2 hours later, it surfaced on the Slack board of a Northside branch in San Antonio, Texas. Title: They said he was a student, but he was the founder. 6 hours later, the video landed in the internal group chat for instructors at Northside Chicago. 12 hours later, an administrative staff member in New Jersey printed Ray's handwritten letter and pinned it to the break room corkboard. The last line was underlined in red. "We don't need heroes. We just need someone to start." At Northside San Jose, a teacher who had been suspended 6 months earlier for not complying with the approved curriculum reposted the first lesson plan she had ever designed, titling it, "A Curriculum Built on Trust, Not Directives." Within one night, she received over 40 emails from colleagues who had thought they were the only ones questioning the center's transformation. At Northside Atlanta, a group of students recorded themselves being forced to reshoot positive answers for promotional videos, then sent the audio to the regional oversight team with a handwritten note. "If this center is truly about training humans, please let us speak with our own voices." In Phoenix, a man named Malcolm, once an engineer, now a student in a data entry class, wrote on the feedback board, "I used to think I was a deleted file, but he showed me maybe I was just hidden." Elise received the first email at 5:33 a.m. on Friday. The sender was an ESL teacher in Boston, someone she had never met. The message contained just 3 lines. "You are not alone. We've read the program assessment. Thank you for standing tall when others bowed their heads." She read the message 3 times. Then she wept silently. Ray, on the other hand, had no social media. He didn't check email after leaving the center that morning. He simply sat at a small cafe on 14th Avenue, the only one in the neighborhood that still carried a physical newspaper. On page 4, a tiny headline read, "Who is the mysterious man who stood before Northside's board?" Beneath it was a photo of Ray with his back turned, his shadow cast onto a classroom whiteboard. He read it, folded the paper, said nothing, just sipped cold black coffee and opened his notebook. On the next page he wrote, "I used to think I was standing alone at the intersection, but it turns out many others were standing there too. They just didn't think anyone was watching." By noon, Elise walked into the second-floor teacher's lounge. On the whiteboard, written in black marker, "Anyone interested in attending Monday's open dialogue session, sign up here." 8 names were already listed. One of them surprised her. Daniels, the mid-level supervisor who had remained silent during Ray's boardroom confrontation. Elise looked at the board, then picked up the marker. She didn't write her name. Instead, she added a line at the bottom. "We need to speak, not to win, but to understand." Luis was busy redesigning a poster, the kind he said should have been there from the beginning. On a pale gray background was the image of a door slightly ajar, light shining through the crack. Pinned to the door was a handwritten note. It wasn't the student who knocked wrong. It was the person inside who forgot how to listen. He posted it on the bulletin board outside classroom B7. No one took it down. Over the following week, the Regional Coordination Office received 173 internal responses from 11 different Northside branches across the country. There were no protests, no banners, no hashtags, only slips of paper, emails, handwritten letters, sticky notes, notebooks, all sharing one thing in common. Someone who once felt invisible now felt heard. Headquarters in Chicago officially called for the first cross-branch strategic dialogue conference in 7 years. Theme: Restoring the Foundation, Who We Are and what we forgot. Ray was invited as an observing guest. He declined. But Elise was invited as a keynote speaker. She accepted. Instead of giving a speech, she brought 6 chairs, each one representing a classroom that had been shut down, a student who had been dismissed, a teacher who had been suspended, a group that was never allowed to exist, a lesson that had been erased from the curriculum, and lastly, a person who was never officially listed anywhere, but quietly swept floors, wiped boards, and corrected errors in exams that no one had bothered to ask about. Ray sat in the last row. He didn't speak, but when Elise finished her presentation, she turned to look at him and nodded. He nodded back. No applause needed, no microphone. Truth sometimes doesn't need someone standing high, just someone willing to take the first step. Across the system, Northside began to reinstate its support programs for slow restart students, reopened free remedial classes, returned paper bulletin boards for feedback, and required all student assessments to be reviewed by 2 independent parties, one from a professional and one from a student who had lived it. The Denver Center began rehanging its founding nameplate, and beneath the name Raymond L. Johnson, a new line, handwritten by Elise, was added, "Not the one who laid the first brick, but the one who never let it crumble." On the first Monday of October, Denver basked in soft sunlight, with just enough breeze to send dry leaves tumbling gently across the sidewalk, bothering no one. There were no honking horns during rush hour, no frantic foot traffic like most Monday mornings. Everything seemed to move half a beat slower, as if the city was giving itself a little more room to breathe. In an old neighborhood where a food distribution warehouse once stood, a low gray-brown building had just been freshly painted. There was no sign on the wall, no name, no banner to say what it was, just a large wooden door with a metal frame, left slightly ajar. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. A room of about 100 square meters, old wooden floors, low ceilings, daylight filtering through a square window on the left. But inside there were sounds, not of lectures, not speeches, just the quiet noise of chairs being straightened, papers being handed out, pens gliding across a whiteboard, and woven among all that, laughter, the kind that had disappeared from Northside many years ago. Ray sat in the back row, as always, but this time he wasn't disguised, wasn't anonymous, wasn't silently observing like a witness. He simply sat there, hands folded, watching forward, where a student named Malik, once labeled low energy, was now explaining an Excel exercise to Daryl. Elise stood near the board, not teaching, but coordinating. She handed out papers, prompted questions, listened. There was no head of the class, only someone keeping rhythm. That room didn't belong to Northside, and not to any formal educational institution. It had been opened using donations from former students, former teachers, and a few staff who had once been let go. Some brought desks, others loaned the space. Someone rewired the Wi-Fi using old hardware, and someone rewrote the curriculum from the original outline Ray had once designed, now updated with the painful lessons they had all just lived through. No one called it a school. They called it the open room, a room with no lock, no name tags, no background checks, only one requirement: to want to learn, to want to listen, to want to begin again. Jenny sat by the window typing steadily, her hands once shaky from medication. Now she was teaching new students how to use the same data entry software she had once failed. When someone asked how she learned it, she answered, "Because someone like me, who got kicked out, was taught again by someone who got erased." She smiled, a smile not sad, just light, like the sunlight beyond the window frame. Luis didn't sit still for long. He moved around the room, checking the printer, replacing paper, fixing wobbly chairs. Someone asked, "Are you the maintenance guy?" He shrugged. "I'm the balancer," a job title he made up himself, and everyone agreed it fit. Daryl Hunter, for the first time, raised his hand to ask a question in front of 12 people. His voice still shook, but it was louder than before. When Elise praised him for being brave, he simply said, "I used to think I had to speak English, like in the center's ads, to be accepted. But now I think it's enough if someone's patient enough to hear my real voice." Ray wrote that down in his notebook. The final page. Not for data, but to remind himself why he began again. Not to fix a system, but to preserve the humanity the system had once misplaced. One afternoon, Elise sat next to Ray in the back row. She asked, "Do you think we've changed anything yet?" Ray replied, "I think we made sure things couldn't keep going wrong without someone asking why." Elise nodded. "That's enough." They sat in silence for a while, watching the front, where Shanice was trying to guide the class through an exercise she once couldn't understand. No one helped her, but the entire class listened. It was the first time she had ever sounded that confident. A month later, Northside branches across the country reinstated Student Story Day, an event previously canceled for being ineffective for PR. They invited dismissed students to share their stories. Elise was invited as a judge at the Chicago conference. She went, but in her speech, she didn't talk about reports or the flawed exams. She spoke about an unnamed room where people came to learn without being judged for their appearance, their accent, or their past. When someone asked, "Who runs that place?" Elise answered, "No one," because the gatekeeper isn't the person with authority. It's the one who listens. Ray didn't go to Chicago. He stayed. One day as he entered the class, he saw a handwritten line on the board. "Those who were once cast out are now the ones being asked." No one knew who wrote it, but he stared at it for a long time, then stepped up to the board and added a line underneath. "And those who were once forgotten are now being remembered." One late evening, after class had ended, Elise found Ray still sitting there. She asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" Ray answered, "No. I just want to be the one to turn off the lights last, to make sure no one gets left behind today." She said nothing, just stood beside him. Outside the door, a new student lingered, a boy about 18, wearing a backpack, holding a simple flyer. "Community class, no requirements." On the flyer was a photo of a blank whiteboard. No center name, no logo, no teacher standing in front. Just one line handwritten in blue ink. "Anyone can knock. The question is someone inside listening?" The boy knocked. Ray opened. He didn't ask anything, just held the door wider, stepping aside. Inside, the soft yellow light was still on. The boy stepped in. The door closed gently behind him. And just like that, everything began. He never raised his voice. He never asked for a title. He just sat in the back row, watched, listened, and when the moment came, he stood up. Not for himself, but for those who were never seen. If this story made you feel something, hope, anger, gratitude, or fire, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Tell us in the comments. Who's the back row person in your life? And if you believe in quiet leadership, in second chances, and in dignity for everyone, hit that subscribe button, because these stories matter, and more are coming.